Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a Senior Engagement Specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream and radio topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. The purpose of these discussions is to discuss various topics relevant to the Northern Road Link, environmental, and impact assessment. And in today's live stream, we're going to discuss the selection of the preferred corridor and the preferred alignment. So, without further ado, let's get started and go to an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So, we're going to start off by talking about the method for evaluating the corridor alternatives. And then we're going to talk about the identified corridor options, the factors, criteria, and indicators, the things that we use to evaluate the different corridor alternatives. We'll talk about the weighting and scoring system, data limitations, the results. We'll show you the preferred corridor. Then we're going to talk about the selection of the preferred alignment and then next steps as we move forward in the project. So let's talk first now about the 7-step process to evaluate corridor alternatives. The first step is to do what's called a SWOT analysis, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And this allows us to take each option and really do that good and bad things, advantages, disadvantages process, put each one through that process. And then what we do from there is we take those corridor options that we want to take forward for more detailed analysis, which is called multi-criteria analysis. Then in step 3, we identify the factors, criteria, and indicators, the things that we're using to help evaluate each of the corridor alternatives. And these are the things that make up the multi-criteria analysis. Then in step 4, we compile the data, put all the data together, get the layers, the different layers of information, and then we run the MCA or multi-criteria analysis model. Step 5 is basically doing that the same thing as step 4, but doing it over and over again to refine that process. It's what you call an iterative process where you go back and forth, you run the model, you may adjust something, you run the model again, and then we move on to step 6, where we summarize the results of the multi-criteria analysis, and then from that evaluation, identify the recommended preferred corridor. And then following that, which is actually where we are now, it's incorporating the feedback from Indigenous communities and stakeholders and finalizing that preferred corridor. So that process is essentially complete. We have identified a preferred corridor. Now, when we talk about corridors, just to remind everyone, we're talking about not the exact position of where the road would be, but a 2-kilometer wide area within which the road would be positioned. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that SWOT analysis. In terms of the history, in 2021, we worked with two corridors, the existing corridor west and the existing corridor east. You can see them on your screen right now. And then in 2024, we added corridors at the request of the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. And these corridors were added related to caribou concerns. So we added the West 1 corridor and the West 2 corridor. And then in 2025, our SWOT analysis concluded that the existing corridor west was the most favorable corridor. And then the corridors recommended for further assessment through the multi-criteria analysis were existing corridor west and existing corridor east. And you can see those on your screen right now. So this next slide may look confusing, but it's really not that confusing. So we took the two corridors, and then for certain segments of of corridor, we had different options in different areas. Um, so, for example, if you look at the map that is on your screen, you have options C1 and C2 and C3 and C4. These are different ways of going from one point to another. So when we look at all these options, you come up with a number of alternatives to be considered. And so we ended up with a total of 8 different options based on this. If we move to the next slide. Uh, so let's talk a bit now about the general approach in terms of using the factors, criteria, and indicators. So the factors are general categories, is the best way to sort of describe it. For each factor, you have criteria, and then for criteria, you have indicators. Now, these factors, criteria, and indicators are tied to values in the environmental assessment terms of reference and the impact assessment tailored impact statement guidelines, or TISG. And then these are also, they were identified by the government agencies, by technical experts, by Indigenous communities and their members, Indigenous groups, the public, and stakeholders. So these are used, as I mentioned before, to complete what's called the multi-criteria analysis. So you're comparing the advantages and disadvantages of the different corridor options. And the way this is done is by using a computer software tool, which is GIS based. And when we say GIS, we're talking about geographic information systems, which are computer systems that work with geospatial information, so geographically referenced information, so map information essentially. So we have a series of different layers, each representing the criteria or indicators or factors that are inputted into the model. And these layers sit on top of each other spatially. So you've got different map layers covering the same area overlaid on top of each other. And the computer then is able to very quickly go through and look through all these layers and allow for fairly quick evaluations as to what areas are preferred more for the road than other. And the data that are used by the GIS software is geospatial data, GIS data from background studies, from open source data sets, government agencies that make them available, these layers for free, and from project specific field surveys. So all those studies that have been undertaken as part of the Northern Road Link project, there are spatial layers or map layers that are generated from the results of many of these studies. Now this next slide dives a little bit more deeply into what factors, criteria, and indicators are. So let's look at a couple of examples to help explain this. So one factor might be Indigenous land use and interests, and then the criteria associated with that factor would be Indigenous land and resource use. Or maybe this might be a little bit more, might be easier to understand. If we look at the biological environment, so that general category of biological environment, within that we could have layers like criteria such as caribou, wolverine, bats, fish and fish habitat, and wetlands. And then indicators are ways of measuring each criteria. So for fish and fish habitat, for example, it might be um, uh, the sensitivity or importance of the fish or fish habitat, or the amount of fish or fish habitat that will be eliminated by the construction of the road. So these are sort of examples of the input layers: factors, criteria, and indicators. If we move on to the next slide, just to give an example, another example for everyone. So indicators are the things that we want to model or consider, something that you can measure, right? Measurable things that reflect the criteria. And then a data set, when we use the term data set, that's like a GIS layer that represents a real world feature. So um, provincial parks, for example, or aquatic habitat, for example. Um, so you can see there's two examples on your screen here. There's a data set from which is from an open source, in this case the Ontario provincial government, and it's water bodies. So it's the polygons, lakes, and ponds, bodies of water. And then another one beside it is showing provincial parks, the area covered by provincial parks. If we move on to the next slide, now we're going to talk about the weighting and scoring system. And this is where you can start to see how sophisticated these tools are for evaluating the corridor alternatives. So you can actually apply importance to different layers. So in this case, what we've done is we've equally applied the weighting to the factors and criteria, but you could within each category or within each factor, like biological environment, you could apply a weight of 40 to area of caribou nursery habitat, or 40 for area of fish habitat with species at risk, and 20 to area of aquatic feeding habitat. So allows us to customize the evaluation and the analysis to reflect, what people think are important or what are generally accepted to be very important. For example, species at risk are very important um, factors to keep in mind. So they might get a heavier rating than other factors as well. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about the limitations of the model. Um, it's guided by the people operating the model, and the choices that are made through consultation with community members, with stakeholders, with the general public, with government agencies as well too. And but the model is really only as good as the data. So um, that it's important to have good quality data. Now, does every model have everything in it? Every single factor represented as a map in this process? No, it's not. But it's a guide. This is a tool for helping to identify the preferred corridor and evaluate the preferred corridor. And it's transparent. It's you can explain the weightings. You can show through the maps how a result was obtained. Um, but some data are just not suitable for the model, and can't be, they may be incomplete, they may be too complex to be captured on a map in a simple map layer, so they can't be included, but they're still included in the overall decision-making process to identify a preferred corridor. If we move on to the next slide, this one shows just the next couple of slides actually are tables that show different factors, the weight associated with each factor, and then the associated criteria. So if we take physical environment, for example, we could give that a factor weight of 20%. The criteria associated with the physical environment could be surface water resources, groundwater resources, greenhouse gases, air receptors, noise receptors. And we could weigh each of those criterion separately. And And so you can see the Pangea weight is the factor weight by the criteria weight. So that's the actual weight that it gets applied to that factor when the overlays are actually done, when the model actually runs. And then if we look at things like socioeconomic environment, there's many criteria, because socioeconomic environment catches many different things: mineral and aggregate resources, forestry, land use or activities, recreational activities, parks and protected areas, potential archaeological resources, archaeological sites, built heritage resources, and cultural heritage landscapes. And then there's the technical considerations, which are more tied specifically to the actual road and its construction. So there's the constructability. How easy or difficult is the road to build in that particular area. So that's a factor. Cost as well too, right? Could be a product of constructability and of length as well too. Then if we move on to the next slide, we'll look at biological environment. There's many different criteria associated with that factor. You've got fish and fish habitat. You've got species at risk, fish and fish habitat. You've got caribou. You've got moose, forest birds, raptors, shorebirds, bog fen birds. The different species at risk, be they wolverine, bank swallow, chimney swift, eastern whippoorwill, or short-eared owl. You've got aquatic species at risk, and then you've got the wetland, upland, and riparian ecosystems as well. So you can see how these factors and their associated criteria contribute to the weight that each layer gets when it goes through the evaluation. In terms of results, this map that you see on the screen shows it's what you call a heat map. And so what you see here is less preferred to preferred, going from orange to green. And so less preferred means a higher score in this particular case, and preferred means a lower score. So the higher the score, the less preferred, the it's not as appropriate a location to place the road corridor, in other words, than an area that might be green or darker green. So this allows us to identify, to quantify, basically um, put a number to, for example, and identify options and their scores so that you can rank them in terms of preferred to less preferred. If we move to the next slide, this actually shows the scoring here. So we're looking at two different options. You have option 1 and option 2. And then you can see for the different factors, you have different scores. The lower scores are preferred, the higher scores are less preferred. And you can see that with the scale at the bottom as well, the legend at the bottom. And if we move on to the next slide, this just zooms in on a particular area. So you can see here, you've got these nesting areas for migratory birds that have been identified, and those are part of less preferred areas for the road corridor to go into. You've got historic trails, which are less preferred for the road corridor to go through. So these are obviously give it a higher score, which makes it less preferred. So these are the kinds of things that get factored into this process of identifying a preferred corridor. And if we move to the next slide, this shows the results for the different options. So you have all the different factors on the left side, and then you have color coded, you have the scores. So green is good, meaning more preferred, and red, especially dark red, is least preferred. So dark green is the lowest possible score. Dark red is the highest possible score. So you can see it's very easy after doing this, and very transparent. It's a very easy and transparent way of identifying and looking at a lot of information to help. So going through a lot of information and looking at different situations or scenarios to identify the best place for that road corridor, that 2 kilometer wide area to go. Then if we move to the next slide, we have a zoom in on the area where the Attawapiskat River crossing will sit within. Um, Obviously, this is a 2 kilometer wide corridor, so the crossing will sit somewhere in this area. Then if we move on to the next slide, this next slide shows the actual preferred corridor. You can see it's colored in the various solid colors. And so that is the one that has been landed upon based on a lot of consultation with communities and with stakeholders and government representatives and the technical team discussions themselves. Um, and that is the corridor that will be going forward through the rest of the process. So now the next step in this process is to select what's called the preferred alignment. If we move to the next slide. And the preferred alignment is the position, is the actual position of the road within the corridor. That's what it refers to. And this work to identify the preferred alignment is a little bit more detailed work. It's mainly where the road goes within that already preferred corridor is it's based mainly on the land or the terrain, but also factors such as how it connects to other roads at either end or other facilities at either end. For example, connecting to resource roads or upgraded roads to the south, or in this case of the Northern Road Link, where it would connect with the Martin Falls Community Access Road, and at the north end, where it would connect with the Webequie Supply Road, and to any future mines in the Ring of Fire area. Other factors are how close aggregate sources are. So the idea is to limit the footprint of the project by having the road fairly close to the where the material that's used to build the road comes from. And you know this is extremely important because the closer that the aggregate sources are to the road, the shorter the access roads are. Sometimes these are temporary. Sometimes these are permanent, depending on whether the pit or quarry is temporary or permanent. The shorter the road is, the fewer the water crossings, the fewer the bridges or culverts or other crossing structures would be required. So the whole idea is to try to minimize the footprint from the road and all these associated facilities as much as possible. And so that's what's involved in selecting the preferred alignment. It's looking at the terrain, it's looking at where the construction materials such as the aggregate come from, it's looking at the best places to put certain support facilities, which I'll get into in our next slide. So if we can move to the next slide, we'll talk about the next steps. So once the preferred alignment has been identified, um, we will have then finalized the locations of what's called ancillary infrastructure. So ancillary infrastructure is all the stuff other than the road that's required to support the road. So some of these are temporary, some of these are permanent. So ancillary infrastructure includes, it could be construction camps, which would be temporary, obviously, lay down areas, which are areas to store equipment and materials. And these are typically temporary because they're there to support the construction. Access roads, these are again temporary or permanent, depending on whether what they're accessing is a temporary or permanent facility. So, for example, an aggregate source, whether it's a pit or quarry, If it's something that's required after the project is complete, after the road has been built, then uh, this would be permanent. If it's only temporary, then the access road would then be removed and the area would be restored back to its previous state. And then, of course, maintenance and storage facilities. These are areas that are used in operations for storing equipment and materials to support the operation of the road. So those are the next steps. Moving on to identifying that preferred alignment, and that is defined primarily by terrain, and how close it is to pits and quarries, and then tying that in with the best places to put this ancillary infrastructure, the camps and the laydown areas, etc. So that's a lot of information, I realize, in a short period of time, but I hope it was understandable to everyone. And that wraps up today's discussion. We hope it was helpful and encourages you to join us again on Tuesday, June 2nd, when we discuss the Indigenous-led process and the Indigenous Knowledge Program. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, northernroadlink.ca. Miigwech, and make sure to look out for project updates on social media and our websites. See you soon.